Hey guys, this is David Payton from New York. Welcome to Boring History Documentary. At first glance, Napoleon's escape from exile can sound almost impossible to take seriously. A defeated emperor watched by Europe, placed on a small Mediterranean island, somehow returned to France and came within reach of power again. But the deeper you look, the less this story feels like a romantic adventure, and the more it begins to reveal itself as something far more instructive. It was not simply a daring escape. It was a political miscalculation by his enemies, a test of memory and reputation, and a reminder that power often survives defeat longer than people expect. And perhaps most interesting of all, the version most people remember is only the surface of what actually happened. Before we settle in, if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history told with a calm pace and a little more depth than usual, subscribing is a very sensible way to keep this kind of documentary close at hand. And if you'd like to support the channel, a quiet like on the video helps more than you might think. As always, feel free to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and which history topic you'd like us to explore in a future episode. To understand how Napoleon escaped exile, we have to begin with an uncomfortable truth for the victorious powers of Europe. In 1814, they had beaten him, but they had not solved the problem of Napoleon. They had forced him to abdicate, entered Paris, restored the Bourbon monarchy, and tried to convince themselves that the great convulsion of the previous 20 years was finally over. Yet the man at the center of that upheaval was not imprisoned in some remote fortress, nor was he quietly removed from public imagination. Instead, he was given a strange and in some ways astonishingly lenient settlement. He was allowed to remain an emperor in title. He was granted sovereignty over the island of Elba. He was even permitted a small guard. Europe had removed him from the French throne, but it had not fully stripped him of the habits, symbols, and instincts of command. That decision now looks extraordinary. At the time, however, it reflected the uncertainty of the moment. The Allied powers wanted peace, but they also wanted legitimacy. They wanted to restore order without appearing vindictive. Napoleon, after all, had abdicated. There were influential men who believed that giving him Elba was a practical compromise, one that removed him from continental politics while avoiding the risks of martyrdom. The calculation was understandable, but it contained a serious misunderstanding. Napoleon was not merely a former ruler who needed a place to live. He was a political force whose identity depended on action. Giving such a man a miniature state did not necessarily neutralize him. It may simply have given him a stage, however small, from which to think, to wait, and to watch. Elba itself was not a prison in the strict sense. It was an island off the Tuscan coast, modest in size, close enough to Europe to remain psychologically connected to the world Napoleon had lost. He reorganized roads, inspected mines, involved himself in local administration, and behaved, even in diminished circumstances, like a ruler determined to impose order. This detail matters because it complicates the popular image. He did not spend his exile merely brooding in theatrical despair. He governed. He reviewed. He planned. Even on Elba, Napoleon remained Napoleon. That continuity of character is one of the keys to the entire story. Still, beneath the activity there were obvious limits. The island was small. Resources were restricted. Income promised under the abdication settlement did not arrive as reliably as he expected. His status was ambiguous. his future uncertain. More importantly, news from France and from the Congress of Vienna began to suggest that the world he had left behind was not settling into the calm order his enemies had hoped for. The restored Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII faced a difficult task. Many French elites wanted stability, but stability did not automatically mean affection for the returning royal court. The Bourbons were associated, fairly or unfairly, with an older political world. Émigrés returned. Old symbols reappeared. The tone of government shifted. For some, this meant welcome restoration. For others, it felt like a clumsy attempt to reverse history. And that was the hidden opportunity. Napoleon did not need France to be in open revolt. He did not need universal devotion. He only needed enough discontent, enough confusion, and enough lingering loyalty within the army to make a gamble conceivable. This is one of the most important corrections to the simplified version of events. His return was not powered by pure charisma alone, and it was not a magical resurrection. It depended on a very specific political environment. A restored monarchy that had not yet secured emotional legitimacy, a military culture that still remembered him, and Allied powers distracted by diplomatic negotiations elsewhere in Europe. By late 1814 and early 1815, Napoleon had reason to think time was working against him if he stayed where he was. Rumors circulated that the Allies might send him somewhere much farther away. Elba, though limited, still allowed proximity. A more remote destination would mean true political extinction. In other words, escape was not merely bold. From Napoleon's perspective, it may have begun to look necessary. That changes the emotional shape of the story. Rather than imagining an emperor seized by sudden ambition, it is more accurate to picture a man reading the strategic map of his own survival and concluding that the window was narrowing. So he prepared quietly. He watched the sea. He kept informed as best he could. He maintained the loyalty of those around him. His little court on Elba was not large, but it was sufficient for secrecy if handled carefully. The British commissioner assigned to observe him, Sir Neil Campbell, was not constantly present, and British oversight, while real, was not airtight. This was another Allied misjudgment. Napoleon had been contained, but not immobilized. Surveillance existed, yet it did not function with the relentless precision that later generations might assume. The belief that the Napoleonic era had essentially ended created a kind of complacency. On the evening of February 26, 1815, Napoleon made his move. He slipped away from Elba with around 1,000 men, along with a small flotilla. The scale of the force is itself revealing. This was not an invasion army. It was not remotely large enough to conquer France by brute strength. The mission only made sense if Napoleon believed something more powerful than numbers would carry him forward. He was betting on recognition, on hesitation among his opponents, and on the possibility that soldiers sent to stop him might decide not to fire. In military terms, it was a frail expedition. In political terms, it was a brilliantly calculated test. He landed in southern France near the Gulf of Juan on March 1, 1815. From there, the choice of route was crucial. Rather than marching through strongly royalist areas where resistance might be heavier, he moved inland through the Alps, following what later became famous as the Route Napoleon. This decision was practical, not romantic. The terrain was difficult, the progress demanding, but it reduced certain immediate risks and allowed his column to move through districts where the Bourbon hold was less dependable. At each stage, the question remained the same. Would France treat him as a criminal fugitive, or as the returning embodiment of a political memory that had never really vanished? This is where the story acquires its almost unbelievable quality, though even here we should resist exaggeration. Napoleon's advance northward was not a smooth triumph from the first moment. It was tense, uncertain, and dependent on how officials, garrisons, and local populations reacted in real time. Yet as he moved, his confidence proved justified. The drama reached its most famous point when royal troops were sent to intercept him. According to the legendary account, Napoleon stepped forward, opened his coat, and declared that if any soldier wished to kill his emperor, he was ready. Whether every word was spoken exactly as later repeated matters less than the outcome. The troops did not shoot. They joined him. That moment has been told so often that it can seem almost mythical, but the deeper lesson is practical. The Bourbon monarchy had legal authority. Napoleon still possessed emotional authority among many veterans. When the two came face to face, legality alone did not guarantee obedience. That is what the restored regime had failed to understand. Armies are not machines detached from memory. They carry habits, loyalties, and shared histories. Napoleon had commanded these men in campaigns that defined an era. Many had followed him across Europe, asking them to regard him suddenly as nothing more than a usurper was easier on paper than in reality. As town after town yielded, the symbolism became overwhelming. What had begun as an escape, that distinction matters. It tells us something larger about post-revolutionary France. Beneath the restored surface, there remained unresolved questions about legitimacy, authority, merit, memory, and national identity. Napoleon had once seemed to answer those questions, or at least contain them. The Bourbons, for all their formal restoration, had not yet found a stable answer of their own. As he advanced, support grew and resistance weakened. The drama was moving toward Paris, but the truly decisive struggle had already begun in the minds of soldiers, administrators, and citizens long before he reached the capital. The extraordinary part was not simply that Napoleon had escaped Elba. It was that he had correctly judged the moral temperature of France from across the water. And that judgment, as remarkable as the voyage itself, would carry him into one of the most astonishing political returns in European history, even as the powers gathered at Vienna were only just beginning to understand that the man they believed finished had placed himself back at the center of events. and that realization spread with shocking speed. At Vienna, where the great powers had been engaged in the careful, sometimes petty, sometimes deeply consequential work of reconstructing Europe, news of Napoleon's landing arrived like a disturbance from another age that everyone had hoped was over. The diplomats had been discussing borders, dynastic claims, spheres of influence, and the balance that would prevent any one power from again dominating the continent. Suddenly, the central figure they had been arranging Europe around was no longer an abstract problem of settlement. He was moving north through France, gathering men, gathering momentum, and forcing every government in Europe to confront a question they had not fully answered in 1814. Had Napoleon truly been defeated, or had he only been displaced? The answer in Paris was becoming clear before anyone had time to frame it properly. Louis XVIII, cautious and intelligent in his own way, understood the danger. His regime had supporters, and it still possessed the legal forms of monarchy, but it did not possess the kind of unquestioned confidence that allows a government to absorb a sudden shock. When Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's former commanders, initially promised the king that he would bring the exile back in an iron cage, it sounded like the old machinery of state was still intact. Yet that famous declaration would soon become one of the clearest symbols of how fragile Bourbon authority had become. Ney marched out as the king's servant and, after confronting the realities around him, returned to Napoleon's side. He was not alone in changing course. The shift was broader and more unsettling. Men who had sworn loyalty to the Restoration now had to decide whether oaths made to a new regime outweighed years of memory, patronage, military fraternity, and political calculation. It is easy to reduce these defections to opportunism, and certainly opportunism played its part. But the more interesting truth is that many officers and officials were navigating a political world in which legitimacy had become deeply unstable. Since 1789, France had lived through revolution, republic, terror, directory, consulate, empire, occupation, and restoration. Each phase had produced new elites, new loyalties, and new definitions of what counted as lawful authority. In such a world, fidelity was no simple matter. Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, yet he had also embodied order after revolution. The Bourbons represented inheritance and continuity, yet they returned in the baggage train of foreign armies. For many Frenchmen, especially those formed by the armies and institutions of the empire, the categories were not as neat as later generations like to imagine. When Napoleon entered Grenoble, the atmosphere changed visibly. This was no longer a dangerous march conducted in uncertainty. It was becoming a national event. Crowds gathered, proclamations spread, and the psychology of the country shifted in his favor. That shift deserves careful attention because it reveals one of the strangest elements of the 100 Days. Napoleon's return looked sudden from a distance, but in another sense it depended on long preparation done by history itself. 20 years of upheaval had taught France to think politically in dramatic turns. Governments did not merely administer. They rose, declared principles, reorganized society, and fell. Napoleon was extraordinarily skilled at reading that emotional landscape. He understood that symbols, timing, and movement could create their own force. By the time he approached Lyon, the question was not simply whether he could reach Paris. It was whether anyone meaningful still intended to stop him. Lyon was a major prize politically and psychologically. Taking it without a decisive struggle showed how the state was dissolving ahead of him. The king's ministers could issue orders, but orders require instruments, and instruments require confidence. Once confidence weakens, command becomes a performance no one fully believes in. That is one reason the escape from Elba still feels so astonishing. The bold voyage across the sea was only the beginning. The greater achievement lay in understanding that governments can collapse gradually and suddenly at the same time. For days they appear to function, then all at once they no longer do. Louis XVIII, the powers at Vienna reacted with unusual speed and unusual unity. On March 13th, even before Napoleon reached Paris, they had declared him an outlaw, placing him beyond the pale of ordinary diplomacy. That phrase was not merely rhetorical. It signaled that the Allies would not treat his return as the restoration of a legitimate sovereign to his throne, but as a dangerous rupture that justified renewed war. Here again, there is a subtle but important point. In previous coalitions against France, alliances had often frayed because interests diverged. In 1815, Napoleon's reappearance did something remarkable. It reconciled men who had been quarreling bitterly with one another only days earlier. Russians, Austrians, Prussians, and Britons suddenly found clarity in a shared purpose. In trying to restore himself, Napoleon had unintentionally restored Allied cohesion. So what did he think he could achieve? This is where the story becomes more layered than the simple tale of a conqueror grabbing back his crown. Napoleon was not marching toward an open continent waiting to be subdued. He knew he faced overwhelming military odds if the Allies mobilized fully. His problem, then, was not only how to reclaim power, but how to legitimize that reclamation fast enough to fracture the coalition against him, or at least complicate its work. He needed France to appear stable, willing, constitutional, and worth negotiating with. In other words, the emperor who had once dominated Europe through conquest now had to present himself as something closer to a national ruler in harmony with liberal expectations. That required an adjustment in tone. Napoleon could not simply resume the empire exactly where he had left it. Too much had changed. France was exhausted by long war. Many elites who might accept his return did not want endless mobilization or a revival of arbitrary rule. His answer was to promise reform. He spoke of peace. He sought to reassure property owners, administrators, and moderate opinion. He revived institutions, summoned political language that sounded more constitutional, and tried to position himself as a ruler who had learned from experience. This effort reached one of its clearest expressions in the Additional Act, a constitutional revision drafted with the help of Benjamin Constant, a liberal thinker who had once opposed him. The partnership itself was revealing. Napoleon understood that military glory alone was no longer enough. He needed intellectual and political respectability, or at least the appearance of it. But that strategy contained its own contradiction. Napoleon wanted to be seen as the chosen head of a reconciled nation, yet he remained Napoleon, a man associated with concentrated authority, command from above, and the extraordinary politics of emergency. French liberals, administrators, veterans, republicans, royalists, and ordinary citizens did not all see his return in the same light. Some were genuinely enthusiastic. Some were cautiously hopeful. Some were resigned. Some were alarmed. The France he re-entered was not a single audience. It was a crowded and divided political society, one that had not forgotten either the achievements or the costs of his rule. This is one of the quieter truths that often disappears behind the drama of the march from Elba. Napoleon came back to power with astonishing speed, but not with uncontested emotional unity. He still inspired loyalty, admiration, and fascination, yet those feelings existed beside fatigue and doubt. The years since 1792 had consumed generations of young men, drained treasuries, destabilized families, and burdened communities. Many French people could admire Napoleon's genius and still fear what his return would bring. That tension would shape everything that followed. He tried to answer it with spectacle and legality. There were ceremonies, decrees, proclamations, and a careful effort to present the new regime not as a reckless reversal but as the authentic expression of national will. The Champ de Mai, and time was growing short. The Seventh Coalition was mobilizing with grim determination. In the Low Countries, British, Dutch, Belgian, and German forces under Wellington were assembling. Prussian armies under Blücher were preparing nearby. Austrian and Russian forces, though farther away, would follow in due course. Napoleon understood the arithmetic. If he waited for the full weight of Europe to converge on France, the strategic situation would become intolerable. His best chance lay in speed. He would move north, strike first in Belgium, separate the Anglo-Allied and Prussian armies, defeat them in sequence, and thereby alter the political climate before the wider coalition could complete its advance. It was, in its essentials, an old Napoleonic solution to a new Napoleonic problem. When diplomacy failed, movement might still create advantage. Yet even this plan shows how much had changed. Earlier in his career, Napoleon often seized the initiative from a position of imperial strength, commanding broad resources and a state machinery honed by years of expansion. In 1815 he was operating under pressure on borrowed time, leading a France that had only just accepted him back and might not endure another catastrophe. The campaign he was about to launch would be brilliant in conception, hurried in preparation, and shadowed from the beginning by the fact that he no longer had unlimited room for error. Still, in military terms, he remained formidable. The army assembled for the campaign in Belgium was not the vast Grand Army of earlier years, and many of its units were newly formed or reconstituted, but it contained experienced officers and enough fighting quality to make the Allies wary. Napoleon's presence alone changed the psychological equation. Wellington respected him deeply, and the Allied commanders knew that speed and surprise could still make him dangerous. There is a tendency, because we know the ending, to imagine the final campaign as an exhausted epilogue. It did not feel that way at the time. To those watching in June 1815, the outcome was not yet settled. Napoleon had already done what many considered impossible once. It was not unreasonable to fear that he might do something extraordinary again. Before leaving Paris, he also had to manage politics at home. That balancing act was delicate. Too much forceful centralization might alienate the moderates he needed. Too much hesitation might weaken the war effort. Every choice now carried double weight, military and political. If he won quickly, many doubts could be silenced. If he stumbled, all those unresolved questions about legitimacy and fatigue would return at once. In that sense, the march from Elba and the coming campaign in Belgium were part of the same gamble. The escape had brought him back. Victory alone could keep him there. By mid-June, the Army of the North began its movement. Columns advanced toward the Belgian frontier with the familiar Napoleonic urgency. Concentration, deception, and the search for separation between enemy forces. The opening move was clever and bold. If he could drive a wedge between Wellington and Blucher, he might beat each before they... And those first clashes, when they came, showed both how dangerous Napoleon still was and how narrow his margin had become. The French crossing on June 15th forced the coalition commanders into hurried decisions. Wellington, operating within a politically mixed army spread across a wide area, had to determine whether Napoleon's move was a serious offensive toward Brussels or a more limited thrust designed to distract and divide. Blucher, aggressive by temperament and less inclined to caution, moved more quickly toward concentration. Napoleon's opportunity lay precisely in that difference. If he could pin one Allied army while striking the other, then the entire campaign might open in his favor. The geography of the coming struggle mattered more than it often receives credit for. Roads, villages, crossroads, and ridgelines shaped the campaign with quiet authority. This was not war fought in abstraction. Armies moved through cultivated land, over imperfect roads, through settlements that would suddenly become names known across Europe. Charleroi, Quatre-Bras, Ligny, Waterloo. Today they sound like fixed points in memory, but in June 1815 they were simply real places into which men marched carrying uncertainty, exhaustion, and orders that were often clearer on paper than on the ground. Napoleon's genius had always depended partly on his ability to turn geography into timing, and timing into advantage. In Belgium, he was trying to do that one more time under conditions that offered less room for correction than before. On June 16th, the campaign split into two connected but distinct battles. At Ligny, Napoleon himself engaged the Prussians under Blucher. At Quatre-Bras, Marshal Ney confronted Wellington's forward elements. The plan, in broad outline, was sound. The French would hold Wellington in place or keep him from effectively supporting the Prussians, while Napoleon would strike Blucher hard enough to disable the Prussian army as a meaningful force. This was classic Napoleonic operational art. Separate Allied armies, beat one decisively, then turn on the other. Yet plans at this level only work when subordinate execution matches central intention. And here, from the very opening, the campaign began to reveal that 1815 was not 1805. At Ligny, Napoleon achieved a real battlefield success. The Prussians fought stubbornly, and Blucher himself showed his usual determination. But by evening the French had broken their line and forced a retreat. It would be Napoleon's last victory. That fact alone gives Ligny a peculiar atmosphere in retrospect. It was not an illusion. It was not a symbolic success disguised as a real one. It was a genuine defeat inflicted on a major Allied army. And yet, even as Napoleon won, the deeper conditions required for total success were slipping. The Prussian retreat, though disorderly in places, did not become annihilation. The army survived. Its cohesion bent but did not break. This was crucial because Napoleon's strategy depended not merely on defeating Blucher but on removing him, or at least pushing him so far away that Wellington would face the French alone. The reasons that did not happen are partly military and partly human. The Prussian army of 1815 was more resilient than some of Napoleon's earlier opponents. It was not the brittle machine of a previous era waiting to shatter after a dramatic reversal. Reform, experience, and leadership had changed it. Officers such as Gneisenau, often less celebrated in popular memory than Blucher, played a critical role in keeping the army directed and purposeful during retreat. Just as important, the Prussians chose to fall back not eastward, away from Wellington, but northward toward Wavre, preserving the possibility of renewed cooperation. That decision, which might look technical when described on a map, may be counted among the most consequential choices of the campaign. It meant that Napoleon had won a battle without yet solving the problem that battle was supposed to solve. At Quatre Bras, matters were even more ambiguous. Ney, facing an enemy force that was initially weak and scattered, had a chance to seize the crossroads decisively before Wellington could fully reinforce it. But the day passed in hesitation, miscommunication, and incomplete exploitation. Troops arrived gradually on both sides. Attacks were launched, resisted, and renewed. The fighting was serious, but the larger significance of Quatre Bras lay in what it prevented. Wellington held the crossroads. He did not destroy Ney, nor Ney him, but the Anglo-Allied army remained in the field and able to continue its link with the Prussians. Once again, Napoleon's opening design had not failed entirely, but it had not reached the level of decision he required. This is where the campaign begins to feel almost painfully contingent. A little more speed, a little more clarity, a little more coordination, and the history of Europe might have unfolded differently. That does not mean Napoleon was somehow robbed by accident, nor that the Allies merely stumbled into fortune. Rather, it means that operations at this level depend on the interaction of many wills and many frictions at once. The mythic image of Napoleon often suggests a commander whose campaigns unfolded like geometry. In reality, even his finest operations contained confusion, delay, and human limitation. In 1815, those limitations had become more dangerous because the political and strategic clock was running so fast. One figure embodies this uncertainty more than most: Marshal Ney. Brave almost to the point of recklessness, charismatic in battle, and long tied to Napoleon's legend, Ney was also capable of erratic judgment under pressure. During the campaign, his decisions became the subject of immense scrutiny, both then and afterward. Did he move too slowly? Did he misunderstand Napoleon's intentions? Did he fail to grasp the urgency of the moment? Historians have debated these questions for generations, and it is wise to resist overly neat answers. Ney was operating in difficult conditions, with incomplete information, against an enemy who was strengthening as the hours passed. Still, the broad point remains. Napoleon's method demanded rapid, precise cooperation from his lieutenants, and in June 1815 he did not consistently receive it. Another name enters here, more technical but deeply important: d'Erlon. One of the enduring puzzles of June 16th concerns the movement of d'Erlon's corps, which spent part of the day marching in a way that affected both Ligny and Quatre-Bras without decisively influencing either. Called in one direction, then another, the corps became a kind of moving absence, an illustration of how command confusion can shape a battle as effectively as direct action. To later commentators, these movements have often looked maddening, as though decision were slipping away through the gaps between orders. That impression is not entirely unfair. Napoleon's plan relied on concentration at the right place and the right time. When large bodies of men were present in theory but not effectively engaged in practice, the elegant structure of the campaign began to strain. Even so, after June 16th, Napoleon still had reason to believe success remained possible. Wellington withdrew from Quatre-Bras after learning that the Prussians had been beaten at Ligny. This was a prudent move, not a panic. He fell back northward toward the position near the village of Waterloo, south of Brussels, where he had already identified ground suitable for defense. Wellington's strengths as a commander were different from Napoleon's. He was not usually at his best in the kind of dazzling offensive operations that make history books glow. He was methodical, careful with terrain, and skilled at extracting stubborn endurance from mixed forces. He also understood politics. Brussels mattered. The defense of the Low Countries mattered. And, perhaps most importantly, time mattered. If he could hold long enough for Prussian support to reappear, then Napoleon's last campaign might reverse itself. Napoleon, for his part, had to choose between direct pressure and secure pursuit. He detached Marshal Grouchy with roughly 30,000 men to follow the Prussians and prevent their reunion with Wellington. On paper, the logic was straightforward. A beaten enemy should be watched, pressed, and kept from interfering elsewhere. Yet this decision, like so many in the campaign, would later appear under harsher light. Grouchy was competent but not brilliant, loyal but not a natural independent commander on the scale this mission now required. Napoleon had given him a task of enormous importance at precisely the moment when the battlefield situation demanded interpretation as much as obedience. The question would soon become whether Grouchy should simply follow the last known direction of the Prussian retreat, or read the larger strategic picture and move toward the sound of the main battle. Before that question ripened, the weather intervened. On the evening of June 17th, as the French pursued Wellington northward, heavy rain fell across the countryside. The roads softened into mud. Fields became sodden. Artillery movement slowed. Infantry trudged in worsening conditions. The rain is one of those details so often repeated that it can seem almost ornamental, a theatrical device placed into the story because it fits so neatly. But it mattered in very practical ways. Napoleon's artillery, long one of the decisive arms of his warfare, needed firmer ground to operate at full effect. Movement, deployment, and timing were all affected. A campaign that had already begun with narrow margins now carried one more burden. Wellington took up position on the ridge south of the village of Waterloo, near Mont Saint-Jean. The battlefield was not vast in the modern imagination, but it offered what he wanted. A reverse slope behind which infantry could shelter, key strong points forward of the main line, and roads leading back toward Brussels. Hougoumont on the right, La Haye-Saint near the center, and Papelotte farther east became names that would. At the same time, the central and left sectors of the battlefield waited under mounting pressure. French artillery prepared. Infantry formed. Wellington's army held its ground behind the ridge, partially concealed, conserving itself as best it could. The psychological strain must have been immense. For the Allied soldiers, many of whom had heard Napoleon's name all their adult lives, this was not an ordinary enemy in front of them. For the French, the day carried the weight of restoration, legitimacy, and survival. Victory would not merely win a battle. It might secure the return from Elba and give the 100 Days a future. Defeat would expose the entire enterprise as a last magnificent gamble. Far to the east, meanwhile, the question Napoleon most wanted answered remained unresolved. Where exactly were the Prussians, and how quickly were they moving? Reports came in, but reports in battle are often fragments dressed as facts. Grouchy had been sent to deal with them, yet the sounds and rumors of movement beyond the main field continued to trouble the French command. Here the campaign's quiet tension sharpened. Napoleon had escaped exile, crossed France, re-entered Paris, and regained imperial power through astonishing speed and judgment. Now, on the ridge and farmland near Waterloo, all of that depended on whether he could win quickly enough before the shadow at the edge of the battlefield became solid men in marching columns. And as the hours advanced and the French prepared their heavier blows against Wellington's line, that shadow was beginning to take shape. And as the hours advanced and the French prepared their heavier blows against Wellington's line, that shadow was beginning to take shape in a way Napoleon could no longer afford to ignore. Around midday, pressure increased against the Anglo-Allied center-left with the great attack of d'Erlin's corps. This was one of the main French efforts of the day, a broad infantry advance intended to batter Wellington's line, force a break, and create the opening through which Napoleon could turn a hard-fought battle into a decisive victory. It was exactly the kind of blow that might once have unsettled an enemy coalition before it found time to gather itself. But Waterloo was not one of the open, fluid battlefields on which French offensive energy could unfold without immediate constraint. Wellington had chosen his ground carefully, and the Allied response, though strained, was disciplined enough to turn the attack into a struggle rather than a collapse. The French columns moved forward under artillery support, climbing toward a ridge behind which much of Wellington's infantry remained partially sheltered. This is an important point because it explains why so many attackers found themselves advancing into an enemy they could not fully judge until the moment of contact. Wellington's reverse-slope positioning reduced the visible target and absorbed part of the artillery effect. When the Allied infantry rose to meet the French at close range, the shock could be sudden and severe. The ground itself, gently undulating rather than dramatically steep, became a quiet accomplice to Wellington's style of defense. He was not trying to win through elegance. He was trying to survive through patience. Even so, the French push was dangerous. Parts of the Allied line bent under the strain, and in those moments Waterloo still looked like a battle that could be decided by weight and persistence. Then came one of the most famous cavalry charges in British military memory. The heavy brigades, including the Scots Greys, crashing into the French formations and disrupting the assault. Here again, popular memory has often polished the moment into something cleaner and more heroic than the reality. The charge was powerful and dramatic, and it did help smash parts of d'Erlin's attack. but it also carried its riders too far forward, exposing them to counterattack and costing them dearly. Waterloo is full of episodes like this, moments of apparent clarity that turn out on closer inspection to be messy exchanges of advantage and loss. That pattern is what made the battle so difficult for Napoleon. Wellington's army did not need to dominate the field. It only needed to remain there. Each French success had to become something larger very quickly, or it would be swallowed again by the Allied line, the terrain, or the arrival of fresh resistance. A local gain that failed to widen into a true rupture simply consumed time and men. And time, more than anything else, was the resource. Meanwhile, the first hard signs of the Prussian approach were beginning to emerge. This is where the battle's atmosphere changes from tense to fateful. Until then, Napoleon could still hope that Wellington might be beaten before outside intervention became decisive. Reports of enemy movement from the east had existed, but reports alone do not always alter a commander's calculation. Now they began to take material form. Prussian forces were moving toward the French right flank in the direction of Plancenoit. Their arrival was not yet overwhelming, but it introduced a second battlefield into the first. Napoleon was no longer simply trying to break Wellington. He was trying to break Wellington while containing Blucher. This dual pressure transformed the meaning of every decision. Men and reserves that might have reinforced the central assault now had to be considered for flank defense. Attention that might have remained focused on Wellington had to be divided. Plancenoit, a village that would otherwise have been just another Belgian settlement in the path of armies, suddenly acquired immense importance. If the Prussians could push through there in strength, they would threaten Napoleon's rear and unravel the whole structure of the French position. If they could be checked, perhaps the main battle could still be won before the eastern pressure became overwhelming. Napoleon responded by sending troops, including elements of the Young Guard and later the Old Guard, toward the growing fight around Plancenoit. This was a serious sign of how the battle was tightening around him. He still intended to defeat Wellington, but he now had to use some of his best troops not to complete victory in the center, but to preserve the battlefield from coming apart on the right. The emperor who had hoped to strike quickly and decide the campaign was being drawn instead into a layered battle of attrition, with time running against him and reserves losing their freedom of action. Wellington, for his part, endured the middle hours with characteristic reserve. He was not a man given to flamboyant command displays, and Waterloo did not turn him into one. He rode the line, shifted units, responded to crises, and trusted certain strong points to buy time. His composure mattered. In armies made up of different national contingents, with varying degrees of experience and confidence, the presence of a commander who appeared unshaken could itself be a stabilizing force. Wellington knew he was under immense pressure, and he also knew that if his line gave way before the Prussians arrived in force, all the patient defensive skill in the world would mean little. He did not need brilliance in the theatrical sense. He needed the army to hold together long enough for the wider logic of the coalition to assert itself on the battlefield. There is a subtle but important reversal here. For most of the Napoleonic era, coalition armies feared being defeated in detail before they could act together effectively. Waterloo gradually turned that fear back upon Napoleon. The longer the battle lasted, the less it resembled one of his classic victories over divided enemies, and the more it became exactly the kind of coordinated pressure he had spent years trying to prevent. His return from Elba had been made possible by speed and by forcing others to react to him. Now, at Waterloo, Speed was draining away, and the Allies were beginning to impose their own rhythm on events. The afternoon brought one of the battle's most debated and consequential episodes: the great French cavalry charges against Wellington's center. These assaults, associated above all with Marshal Ney, have long puzzled military historians. Why did so much cavalry advance against infantry that had not clearly broken and against a position not yet? This was not because the cavalry attacks were meaningless. They shook Wellington's center. They inflicted loss. They increased the strain on already battered formations. They contributed to the impression, felt by many present, that the battle was balanced on a knife edge. But they also exhausted men and horses, consumed initiative, and reflected a growing impatience within the French command. Napoleon needed something to give way. Wellington's line, though stretched and damaged, still did not yield. And throughout this, the Prussian presence kept increasing. Around Plancenoit, fighting intensified. Villages in Napoleonic warfare often became far more important than their peacetime appearance would suggest. Streets, churchyards, houses, and walls could anchor resistance or channel assault with stubborn effect. At Plancenoit, the combat was fierce and highly consequential. French forces counterattacked and retook parts of the village more than once. The Imperial Guard, committed there in part, fought with the determination expected of elite troops. But each commitment to that struggle represented a commitment not available elsewhere. Napoleon was, in effect, paying to keep the battle mathematically possible. It is worth pausing here to notice how that final commitment would center on the Imperial Guard. No formation in Napoleon's army carried greater symbolic weight. The Guard was more than an elite reserve. It was a repository of prestige, confidence, and political meaning. To commit it was to say that the moment of decision had come. To see it repulsed would mean more than a tactical setback. It would strike at the emotional architecture of French confidence on the field. Napoleon understood this as well as anyone. He had long used the Guard carefully, aware that its power lay partly in the fact that it was not thrown away casually. If the Guard went forward now, it would do so not as an ornament of empire, but as the last concentrated expression of his attempt to make the return from Elba endure. Even before that attack formed, the mood of the battlefield was changing. The French still fought hard. Parts of the line still held. But pressure from the east continued to thicken, and Wellington's battered army remained upright. The field was narrowing, psychologically as much as physically, toward a single question. Could Napoleon still create one irreversible break before the coalition weight around him became too great? Or had the astonishing gamble that began on Elba finally reached the point where courage, experience, and calculation could no longer rescue it from time itself? As dusk approached and the Guard prepared to move, that question was no longer abstract. It was marching toward the ridge. It was marching toward the ridge in the last light of a day that had already consumed so much of Napoleon's margin for recovery. By early evening on June 18, 1815, the Emperor could still see a narrow path to victory, but it was now the kind of path that exists only if one final blow lands with absolute clarity. Wellington's line had suffered heavily. Some Allied units were close to breaking. The center had been shaken. La Haye-Saint had fallen. The French still held enough of the battlefield to imagine that one concentrated assault by elite troops might rupture the Anglo-Allied position before the growing Prussian pressure became overwhelming. In that sense, the commitment of the Imperial Guard was not irrational. It was the logic of desperation applied by a commander who still believed that disciplined violence, placed at the critical point, could decide the fate of states. The Guard carried more than muskets and bayonets, carried myth. These were not ordinary units in the imagination of France or of Europe. The Imperial Guard represented continuity, prestige, and the hardest core of Napoleonic military identity. Veterans in bearskins and long service, associated with past triumphs with Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, Wagram, and a long tradition of battlefield endurance. Even where the practical distinction between elements of the Guard could become technical, the symbolic distinction was unmistakable. If these men advanced, it meant the emperor was spending not merely soldiers but reputation. That is one reason Waterloo would later become such a powerful memory. The final stages of the battle were not just tactical. They were theatrical in the deepest historical sense, because institutions, symbols, and identities were being risked in plain view. The exact composition and sequence of the Guard's advance have been argued over in detail, as such moments often are. Battlefield recollections, later memoirs, and national memory all blur together when an event becomes legendary. But the essential reality is clear enough. Elements of the Guard moved against Wellington's center-right area, hoping to pierce the line, exploit weakness, and transform a day of attritional struggle into decisive victory. This was not a vast sweeping attack by the entire reserve. It was more focused and more limited than some later retellings suggest. Yet its significance was still immense. The emperor was making the decision he had been trying to avoid all afternoon. He was gambling the last moral and tactical reserve of his army. As the Guard advanced, the battlefield narrowed emotionally around them. This is one of the reasons the episode has remained so fixed in the historical imagination. Wellington's line, however, had not yet spent itself. Units were repositioned. Some lay down behind the ridge to reduce losses and remain hidden until the critical moment. Others waited under severe strain, uncertain perhaps of how much more pressure they could bear, but still in place. The Anglo-Allied army was a coalition in its own right, with all the complexity that implies, yet by this stage of the day it was functioning with remarkable stubbornness. This is where one of the deeper truths of Waterloo reveals itself. The battle was not won by one single national myth. It was won by endurance across a composite force, under a commander whose talent lay less in spectacle than in preservation. Wellington had chosen ground, distributed strain, and waited for the coalition. Napoleon himself remained on the field for as long as he could meaningfully influence events, trying to restore order, commit reserves, and preserve what remained of the army's integrity. But there comes a point in some battles when command no longer consists of directing victory or even shaping defeat in any grand sense. It becomes the desperate management of fragments. That point had been reached. With Wellington's army advancing and the Prussians pressing harder from the east, the French position unraveled into retreat and then into rout along key roads. Darkness, smoke, and exhaustion added to the chaos. The emperor who had once dictated terms across Europe was now trying to pull the remains of his last field army away from total destruction. If the escape from Elba had shown Napoleon at his sharpest in political reading and personal audacity, Waterloo showed the limits of that audacity when it encountered a continent no longer willing to drift apart in front of him. He had returned because France had remained vulnerable to his name and because the restored monarchy had not yet settled into legitimacy. But the return had always contained two separate tests. The first was whether he could reclaim power. The second was whether he could defend it against Europe. He passed the first with astonishing brilliance. At Waterloo he failed the second. And yet even here, the story retains a twist that is often overlooked. Waterloo did not instantly erase the force of Napoleon's political presence inside France. Defeat on the battlefield was decisive in strategic terms, but politics still had to catch up with military reality. Armies had to retreat, news had to travel, institutions had to respond, deputies had to decide whether the emperor could still shield the nation or had become its greatest danger. A battle, even one as famous as Waterloo, does not automatically govern the next morning in a capital city. It changes the possibilities. It does not by itself perform every consequence. Napoleon withdrew toward Paris with what remained of his authority under severe strain. He had lost the battle that was supposed to secure the 100 Days, but he was not yet a prisoner, and France was not yet occupied again in full. For a brief moment, there remained a political question. Could he continue the struggle? Could France rally once more? Could some negotiated arrangement preserve something of the regime? Those possibilities were narrow, but they were not imaginary in the first hours after defeat. This is why the days following Waterloo matter so much. They reveal not just how empires fall, but how political systems decide when a man who embodied them has become too dangerous to retain. When word reached Paris, the atmosphere was tense, confused, and increasingly grim. The legislative bodies, which Napoleon had tried to manage without entirely dominating during the 100 Days, were not eager to become passive instruments in a final collapse. Many deputies feared invasion, occupation, and national ruin more than they feared imperial prestige. The emperor's position, already dependent on speed and success, had always rested on a fragile compact. He could be tolerated, even welcomed, if he seemed to offer defense, dignity, and stability. A defeated emperor marching back from Belgium offered something very different: the prospect of another national disaster in his name. Here again, one sees how different 1815 was from earlier stages of the Napoleonic era. In the days of the Consulate and early empire, Napoleon often seemed identical with French strength and administrative recovery. By the end, after years of war, conscription, and losses culminating in the Russian disaster and the campaigns of 1813 and 1814, that identity had frayed. He still commanded loyalty. He still inspired awe. But this is one of the profound ironies of the whole story. In 1814, the Allied powers had tried to solve the Napoleonic problem by compromise. They had given him Elba, a title, income, a guard, and proximity. In 1815, after the march from Elba to Paris and the climactic defeat in Belgium, compromise looked not humane or prudent but naive. The very success of Napoleon's first escape ensured that his second exile would be of a completely different kind. Europe had learned, and learned harshly. If he were merely placed somewhere near the continent again, he would remain a possibility. And possibility in politics can be as destabilizing as action. For several days after his second abdication, Napoleon's future remained unsettled in practical terms. He was still in France. He still had adherents. The military situation was deteriorating, but the process of occupation and political transfer was not instantaneous. There were discussions of escape to America, There were thoughts of continuing resistance from the south or from some remaining bastion of loyalty. There were hopes, perhaps faint, that British moderation or division among the Allies might still leave him some room to negotiate. Such hopes were not entirely absurd from the perspective of a man who had just spent months overturning assumptions. After all, he had already done the improbable once by leaving Elba and regaining Paris. Why should the story not bend again? But the material conditions were closing around him. The Allies were advancing. The Bourbons were preparing to return. French political institutions were not rallying to a last imperial stand. Ports were watched. Sea access became a strategic question. Napoleon moved westward toward Rochefort, where the possibility of transatlantic escape seemed, for a moment, to offer perhaps the last opening not yet sealed. The Atlantic, unlike the Mediterranean near Elba, suggested distance, uncertainty, and the chance of reinvention beyond Europe's immediate grasp. Yet reaching the ocean and using it were not the same thing. British naval power, so often the quiet constant in the background of the Napoleonic age, now stood at the edge of the final act. And so the man who had escaped one island and crossed a kingdom now found himself moving toward the coast, not as a triumphant returner this time, but as a defeated ruler searching for a route that had not yet been closed, while the question of where Europe would send him next was beginning to take on a very different and far more permanent meaning. And that meaning was becoming clearer with every mile west. Napoleon's movement toward Rochefort was not a continuation of the same gamble that had carried him from Elba to Paris. It was, in a quieter but perhaps even more revealing way, the mirror image of it. Earlier in 1815, he had escaped because he still believed that speed, surprise, and the lingering instability of France could reopen history in his favor. Now he was trying to outrun closure itself. The question was no longer whether he could seize power back from hesitant enemies. It was whether he could avoid being fixed once and for all in a place from which politics could no longer be reached. Rochefort, on the Atlantic coast, became the setting for one of the strangest pauses in Napoleon's life. He had been emperor, legislator, conqueror, administrator, exile, returned emperor, and defeated sovereign again. Now he was a man near the sea, with limited options, surrounded not by the drama of battle, but by the slower pressure of logistics, diplomacy, and naval control. This is one of the reasons the final phase of his story can feel less familiar than the march from Elba or the Battle of Waterloo. It lacks the immediate simplicity of a battlefield legend, and yet it tells us something essential. Great political careers do not end only in decisive charges or grand proclamations. They can also end in hesitation at a harbor, in discussions with aides, in uncertainty over ships, tides, and enemy patrols. There were still plans, or at least possibilities. One route pointed toward the United States. America carried a certain symbolic promise. Distance from European monarchies, political ambiguity, and perhaps a future in obscurity or even quiet authorship. Napoleon was not old by ordinary standards. One can see why the idea had force. To leave Europe entirely might have been to escape not just immediate danger but the whole exhausted pattern of coalitions, congresses, and dynastic settlements that had finally closed around him. There were ships available in the broad sense, though not always under conditions that made departure plausible. There were disguises proposed, routes discussed, opportunities weighed. But every such possibility ran up against the same hard fact. The Royal Navy had mastered the surrounding waters with the sort of patient control that rarely produces theatrical scenes but often decides history. British sea power had been one of the deepest structures beneath the entire Napoleonic era. It did not always occupy the center of dramatic storytelling because it worked as Napoleon waited at Rochefort in July 1815, his circumstances acquired an almost suspended quality. He was neither free in any meaningful strategic sense nor yet formally in enemy custody. He still had attendance, still had the habits of command, still possessed that dense personal gravity which so often made those around him feel that events might bend again if only he chose the right course. But waiting has its own erosions. The longer he remained, the more the available choices became not different paths to initiative but different forms of surrender to circumstance. This is a deeply human part of the story, and one often overshadowed by the larger historical machine. There is a point at which a man defined by action begins to understand that action itself may no longer produce escape. Could he have slipped away disguised as a merchant sailor or in some smaller vessel? Such questions have fascinated historians and admirers for generations, and they are not foolish questions. The coast was not mathematically sealed in every instant, but practical difficulty and political risk were immense. Napoleon was too recognizable, too valuable, and too symbolically dangerous to be treated like any other fugitive. Those advising him had to think not just about whether a vessel might physically get to sea, but whether it could do so with secrecy, timing, and enough luck to avoid interception. Luck at this stage was not a strategy. Another possibility lingered, one that in some ways would prove far more consequential than any disguised flight. Napoleon could place himself in British hands, not as a prisoner captured in battle, but as a supplicant appealing to British law, British honor, or British magnanimity. It was an extraordinary idea if viewed through the longer arc of his career. Britain had been his most persistent external enemy, the power that had subsidized coalitions, contested the seas, and refused the sort of continental compromise that sometimes worked elsewhere. Yet by 1815 Britain was also, in Napoleon's imagination, a constitutional state with traditions of legality and public opinion. He may have hoped that surrendering to Britain would produce a more tolerable exile than falling directly into the hands of the restored Bourbons, Prussians, or Austrians. This is where the script of his life acquires another subtle reversal. The man who had shaped and bullied Europe through military power now had to imagine his safety in terms of legal treatment by an enemy state. He wrote to the Prince Regent in language that famously likened his appeal to Themistocles seeking hospitality from an old adversary. The comparison was carefully chosen. It cast Napoleon not as a defeated criminal but as a great political figure asking asylum under civilized norms. It was part rhetoric, part genuine hope, and part final gamble with political image. Even at the edge of defeat, he was still framing his position in historical terms. On July 15, 1815, Napoleon surrendered himself aboard HMS Bellerophon to Captain Frederick Maitland. The scene has often been romanticized, sometimes sentimentalized, sometimes treated as the last dignified act of a fallen giant. There was indeed dignity in it, but there was also ambiguity. Napoleon did not necessarily believe he was submitting to permanent imprisonment. He appears to have expected, or at least hoped, that Britain might allow him to reside in the country or in some less restrictive setting. British authorities, however, had learned the lesson of Elba far too thoroughly to permit another half solution. A man who had escaped one island and thrown Europe back into war could not be left anywhere from which return remained imaginable. For a brief time aboard the Bellerophon, Napoleon found himself in a kind of public limbo. The ship became an object of fascination. Crowds gathered to glimpse him when it anchored in British waters. This is one of those striking moments that reveal how Napoleon had become more than a ruler or general. He was now a public spectacle in the modern sense. Famous even in defeat, morally controversial, politically dangerous, and irresistibly watchable. The same British nation that had spent years opposing him also wanted to see him, to assess him, to bring the legend into visible form. Fame and captivity were beginning to merge. The British government moved decisively. The answer would not be Britain, and it would certainly not be some near-European residence. The chosen destination was St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from the centers of European politics. Here, finally, one sees how completely the logic of exile had changed since 1814. Elba had been a compromise exile, near enough to watch Europe and dangerous precisely because of that nearness. St. Helena would be an exile designed to end history's temptation to reopen. Remote, the distance matters immensely. St. Helena was not merely farther away than Elba. It belonged to a different geography of power altogether. Elba sat within the Mediterranean world Napoleon knew intimately, close to Italy, close to France, close to memory. St. Helena floated in a vast oceanic emptiness, connected more to imperial shipping routes than to the political rhythms of Europe. To send Napoleon there was to remove him not just from his former empire, but from the very tempo of continental events. There would be no easy correspondence, no quick intelligence, no plausible flotilla, no sympathetic regiments waiting over the horizon. Europe was not going to make the same mistake twice. The voyage itself began in August 1815 aboard HMS Northumberland. Long sea journeys have a way of flattening drama into duration. Days repeat. Horizons remain empty. Conversation, memory, and anticipation take over from action. For Napoleon, the passage must have had a peculiar quality. He was not yet at St. Helena, but the shape of his future had already been decided. This is often the cruelest part of political defeat. Not the first blow, but the interval in which the defeated person fully understands the conditions from which there will be no return. Earlier exiles, earlier retreats, earlier campaigns had always preserved a remainder of possibility. This voyage did not, and yet even during this transition, Napoleon continued to behave as Napoleon. He conversed, interpreted, assessed, and began the process that would define much of his final years, turning lived power into narrated power. This too is a kind of strategy. If Europe had closed the military and political avenues of return, memory remained. Reputation remained. Posterity remained. A man who could no longer command armies might still command how future generations would think about those armies. On the voyage and later on St. Helena, Napoleon increasingly occupied this terrain. He became at once a defeated ruler and the editor of his own legend. When he arrived at St. Helena in October 1815, the island presented an immediate contrast to the world he had spent his life dominating. It was rugged, remote, and constricted by nature as much as by policy. High volcanic land, steep approaches, ocean all around, a place where distance itself did much of the guarding before any soldier had to. He was initially housed at the Briars, then later at Longwood House, the residence that would become inseparable from the image of his final captivity. Longwood was not a dungeon in the medieval sense, but it was uncomfortable, isolated, and symbolically crushing. Damp conditions, persistent wind, limited society, endless surveillance, and the awareness that Europe now existed far beyond his reach gave the place its oppressive character. This is another point where common assumptions deserve quiet correction. Napoleon's final exile was not simply a melodramatic imprisonment of a titan in chains. It was, in some ways, more modern and more psychologically exact than that. He was allowed attendance, correspondence under restrictions, daily routines, arguments, walks, and the habits of a reduced court. But every one of those habits unfolded inside a system designed to remove uncertainty. He could not become politically active in any meaningful way. He could not disappear into a crowd. He could not sail away unnoticed. He could not plausibly return. St. Helena was the administrative answer to the failure of Elba. The British governor most associated with this phase, Sir Hudson Lowe, has remained a contested figure in Napoleonic memory. To admirers of Napoleon, Lowe often appeared, and while this mythology grew, daily life at Longwood unfolded in a much quieter register. Napoleon talked, read, dictated, reflected, played cards, took exercise when he felt inclined, and increasingly turned to the work of retrospective explanation. Those around him, including figures such as Las Cases, Montholin, Bertrand, and others, became participants in a kind of narrative workshop as much as a household. Conversations were noted, recollections were shaped, judgments on campaigns, statesmen, ministers, and betrayals were formulated and reformulated. The exile court was no longer a center of decision, but it remained a center of interpretation. That distinction is essential. Napoleon had lost the power to govern Europe. He had not lost the urge to arrange Europe in memory. The result was something historically powerful and very lasting. St. Helena, which was meant to end his practical relevance, helped create his posthumous one. Removed from real politics, he could present himself more selectively. The years of war, censorship, ambition, and domination could be reframed through the language of order, merit, national energy, betrayed opportunity, and the hostility of old monarchies. None of this was simply false, but neither was it neutral. Napoleon was not writing confession. He was constructing posterity. And posterity, unlike the sea around St. Helena, remained open water. There is a calm irony in that. The Allies had chosen remoteness because they feared the force of his return. In doing so, they helped create the setting in which his legend could be purified of some of its immediate complications. Distance softened certain memories and sharpened others. The administrative ruler, the censor, the dynast, the conscriptor of vast armies, the man responsible for immense bloodshed across Europe, could gradually be overshadowed by the image of the exile speaking of law, talent, glory, and fate. In life, power had made him feared. In exile, restraint made him fascinating. Yet none of this happened all at once. The routine at Longwood still had to be lived day by day. Health ebbed and flowed. Relations with British authorities soured and hardened. Household tensions emerged. The climate and conditions took their toll. Even a man adept at converting experience into meaning had to endure the practical monotony of isolation. There were intervals of energy and intervals of despondency. There were plans for memoir, complaints over rank and forms of address, arguments over movement and access, and the growing sense that the rest of his life might pass not in one grand final act but in repeated small contests over dignity, memory, and control. And it was within that slow, constricted world, far from Paris, farther still from Elba, and impossibly distant from the roads of Belgium, that Napoleon began the final transformation of his career from political fact into historical inheritance, while Europe, believing the matter settled at last, watched to see whether confinement could succeed where victory and exile had twice failed. And that question, whether confinement could succeed where victory and exile had twice failed, shaped almost every detail of Napoleon's life on St. Helena. The British did not merely want to keep him far away. They wanted to keep him politically inert. That distinction is important. Distance alone was not enough if messages, visitors, or rumors could still turn a remote prisoner into a continental problem. So the system built around Longwood was one of vigilance, paperwork, and recurring irritation. Visitors were controlled. Movements were watched. Correspondence was monitored. Titles were disputed. Even the language used to describe Napoleon became part of the struggle. The British authorities preferred General Bonaparte, a form that deliberately denied imperial sovereignty. Napoleon and his household rejected it. To them, this was not a small point of etiquette. It was a political attempt to reduce the meaning of his entire career. That symbolic struggle may seem minor compared with armies and thrones, but in exile symbols can become the last territory still worth defending. Napoleon no longer commanded France, yet he could still insist on being treated as Napoleon. Lost cases played a central role in this process, especially in the early period. His record of conversations and observations would later become enormously influential, not because it offered a neutral transcript of daily life, but because it helped shape the emotional tone in which Europe remembered Napoleon. Through such accounts, the exile appeared reflective, dignified, often wronged, and increasingly separated from the harsher textures of his rule. The campaigns remained, of course, but they were filtered through a retrospective voice. Administrative achievements were emphasized. Ideas of merit, order, and national energy were sharpened. Failures could be explained through bad luck, betrayal, or the hostility of circumstances. Even where the material contained truth, it was truth arranged for effect. This matters because the Napoleonic legend was not an accidental byproduct of exile. It was actively cultivated there. That does not mean Napoleon invented himself from nothing. No one could have done that after such a public life. But he could choose emphasis. He could choose the moral geometry of the story. He could encourage the view that he had been the necessary heir to revolution without its chaos, the defender of talent against old privilege, the organizer of Europe's political modernity, and the victim of dynastic powers unable to accept a man raised by ability rather than birth. That version was not wholly false. It simply moved certain costs and contradictions into softer light. And those contradictions were real. This is one of the reasons St. Helena remains so historically interesting. It is easy, especially in later memory, to see Napoleon only as the tragic exile. But the tragic exile was also the architect of censorship, dynastic war, and immense conscription. He was the man who stabilized parts of post-revolutionary France, but also the man who repeatedly risked that stability through expansion and personal ambition. He opened careers to talent and codified institutions that outlived him, Yet he also concentrated authority with relentless confidence in his own judgment. On St. Helena, those contradictions did not disappear. They were simply absorbed into a narrative where the pathos of distance made them easier to overlook. Meanwhile, daily life at Longwood could be uncomfortable, repetitive, and frequently unpleasant. The house itself was not well suited to comfort. Dampness, wind, and concerns over sanitation or general habitability became recurring complaints. Napoleon's household, though loyal in important respects, was not immune to tension. Exile compresses social worlds. Small disagreements grow in importance when there is no easy escape from one another. Questions of access, precedence, fatigue, loyalty, and personal grievance all became part of life there. The image of a silent, noble banishment can therefore mislead. St. Helena was not a single posture of majestic suffering. It was an ongoing human environment, full of routine, discomfort, vanity, boredom, and occasional sharp resentment. Relations with Hudson Lowe made that atmosphere worse. Lowe has often been remembered as the villain of the piece, a narrow official unable to comprehend the scale of the man before him. There is some justice in the charge, though perhaps not in its most melodramatic form. Lowe was operating under heavy responsibility. If Napoleon escaped again, the consequences for Europe and for Lowe personally would have been immense. He therefore tended toward suspicion, procedural rigor, and an inability to relax constraints even when flexibility might have reduced friction. Napoleon, on the other hand, had no intention of making Lowe's task emotionally easy. He was proud, sensitive to rank, conscious of insult, and keenly aware that public opinion outside St. Helena might eventually hear of every indignity. Their encounters and disputes thus formed a kind of exhausted duel, each man confirming the other's instincts. The British restrictions were not static. They shifted over time, sometimes easing, sometimes tightening, often depending on perceived risk or on quarrels inside the household. But the structure remained fundamentally the same. St. Helena existed to make return impossible. There would be no third astonishing reappearance on a European shore. The ocean itself guarded against that. And yet, in a curious way, the very finality of the arrangement sharpened Napoleon's ability to think in terms beyond immediate politics. Once the possibility of return became truly implausible, memory became the true field of action. This is why St. Helena should not be seen merely as an epilogue after the real drama had ended. It was the place where Napoleon's life began to split into two historical entities. One was the actual former emperor, aging in confinement, increasingly limited by health and environment. The other was Napoleon as idea, organized through recollection, grievance, admiration, and selective explanation into a figure who could outlive military defeat. The first man was trapped on an island. The second was already moving outward into Europe's imagination. That outward movement was helped by the broader political climate of Restoration Europe. The powers that had defeated Napoleon wanted order, legitimacy, and the reassertion of dynastic principle. Yet their very success created conditions in which nostalgia and comparison became possible. The restored monarchies did not always inspire the same emotional loyalty they claimed as their right. Administrative continuity with the Napoleonic period remained in many places. Veterans remembered service under the empire with a mixture of pride and grief. Liberals, nationalists, and merit-minded reformers across Europe could look back on Napoleon in complicated ways. He had been an oppressor in some lands and a transmitter of modern institutions in others. He had conquered, but he had also broken old structures. That ambiguity made him unusually durable as a symbol. A curious reversal followed. While governments treated him as a dangerous captive, parts of public culture began to treat him as a historical touchstone. This did not happen in a single, uniform way. In Britain, one could find hostility, fascination, satire, and admiration living side by side. In France, memory was contested and politically charged. Among former soldiers, sentiment could be very different from that among Bourbon loyalists. But the broad pattern was unmistakable. The further Napoleon receded from immediate power, the easier it became for many people to detach his image from the full burden of his decisions and attach it instead to energy, talent, and lost greatness. At Longwood, this transformation unfolded against the background of declining health. Napoleon's physical condition has been endlessly debated, and some of the later controversies took on a dramatic life of their own, especially questions about the precise cause of death. But long before the end, it was clear that his health was not robust. He suffered from recurring ailments, periods of lethargy, gastric discomfort, and a general reduction in vitality. Some of this may have been worsened by environment, routine, diet, emotional strain, or hereditary factors. Exile is not only political, it works upon the body. The shrinking of a world can become a shrinking of physical energy as well. Yet even infirmity could be folded into the legend. The weakening body did not erase the force of the mind in conversation, nor the image of a great actor of history constrained by lesser men and an inhospitable island. Visitors and observers, even when not fully sympathetic, often came away aware that they had encountered not simply a prisoner but an immense concentration of historical experience. Napoleon understood the value of that effect. He could be charming, reflective, incisive, dismissive, ironic, or cold, depending on circumstance. But he rarely ceased being conscious of the impression he made. He also continued to interpret the great events of his life through a framework that favored coherence. In his telling, he had often been compelled by necessity, by the instability of Europe, by the failures of others, or by the inexorable logic of revolution and war. This tendency was not unusual among political figures reflecting on defeat, but Napoleon's scale made it especially influential. He could make almost any campaign sound part of a larger intelligible arc. He was very good at giving history form. What is striking is how much of later public memory accepted that form, even when historians have since complicated or challenged it. Take the return from Elba itself. In purely strategic terms, it was one of the most extraordinary political and military gambles in modern Europe. Still, Longwood remained the place where the actual man had to live. There were losses within the household. Lost cases departed after conflict with the authorities. Others remained, but exile altered relationships over time. Loyalty under such conditions becomes complex. It may include genuine devotion, dependence, fatigue, calculation, affection, and shared myth-making all at once. Napoleon needed witnesses, listeners, and attendants, not merely for comfort but for the continuation of his historical project. Those around him needed purpose as well, and his presence continued to provide it, even in reduced form. A court in exile is still a court, if only because hierarchy and memory persist inside it. One of the most quietly significant features of these years is that Napoleon never fully became private. Even when walking, reading, dictating, or complaining about local matters, he remained a public figure in intention. The possibility that his words would circulate later gave almost everything a second audience. He lived inside posterity before posterity had fully arrived. That is a difficult condition to inhabit, and perhaps an exhausting one, but it also helps explain why St. Helena produced not silence but narrative abundance. Outside the island, Europe moved on in official terms. The Congress settlement shaped borders and diplomacy. Restoration politics deepened and encountered new strains. National and liberal movements simmered. Regimes sought stability. Trade resumed. Armies demobilized. Administrations normalized. Yet Napoleon's shadow lingered over all of this. He had not merely been defeated. He had altered the political vocabulary of the continent. Merit, code, administration, mobilization, nationalism, conscription, centralized state action, the relationship between revolution and order, these questions did not vanish with him. St. Helena confined the man, but not the historical problems through which he had risen. This is another reason the story of his final exile matters in a documentary centered on his escape from Elba. The escape was astonishing not simply because it succeeded, but because it revealed how much Napoleon still mattered after formal defeat. St. Helena revealed the other side of the same truth. He mattered so much that Europe felt compelled to imprison him beyond practical return. The distance between Elba and St. Helena is therefore not only geographical. It measures the learning curve of the powers that opposed him. Once they had seen what one insufficient exile could produce, they designed the second to erase even the faintest possibility of repetition. But there remained one further transformation still underway. As the years passed, Napoleon's voice from St. Helena became less the voice of a ruler waiting for events and more the voice of a historical witness shaping the terms on which he would be remembered after death. His physical world narrowed, yet his intended audience widened. He was no longer speaking to ministers, marshals, or legislatures. He was speaking to future France, to Europe, to readers not yet born. That shift gave his exile an unusual density. Even in stillness, he was conducting a campaign of interpretation. And as illness increasingly interrupted routine, as Longwood grew less a temporary station than the settled horizon of whatever life remained, that campaign of interpretation became more urgent, more distilled, and more closely bound to the question of what sort of figure Napoleon would become once the body failed and only the story remained. And that question, what sort of figure Napoleon would become once the body failed and only the story remained, began to shape the final years on St. Helena with increasing intensity. Exile had first been a problem of security, then a problem of dignity, and by degrees it became a problem of legacy. The practical routines of Longwood still continued. Meals, conversations, complaints, walks when health allowed, arguments over restrictions, recurring frustrations with British oversight. But beneath those routines, something quieter and in some ways more decisive was happening. Napoleon was no longer merely living out the aftermath of defeat. He was arranging the emotional and political meaning of that defeat for a world he would not see. This is where St. Helena The refinement mattered because memory is often less loyal to complexity than to shape. Napoleon understood that posterity would not hold every campaign, decree, compromise, or misjudgment in equal focus. What it would remember, above all, was pattern. Rise from obscurity, mastery in war, order after chaos, overreach, betrayal, fall, return, final defeat, captivity, death in exile. It is almost classical in form, and one senses that Napoleon knew this very well. He had lived through one of the most turbulent periods in modern European history, yet by the end of his life he was also helping transform that turbulence into something with the moral clarity of legend. At Longwood, the atmosphere remained difficult. Health problems increased. There were periods of weakness, digestive trouble, fatigue, and reduced appetite. The damp environment and general discomfort of the house continued to provoke complaint. The disputes with Hudson Lowe never settled into genuine civility. Even when open confrontation was absent, mistrust remained the governing principle. To Napoleon, Lowe embodied the pettiness of a world that could defeat greatness only by surrounding it with clerks, sentries, and procedural obstacles. To Lowe, Napoleon embodied the danger of a man whose charm and symbolism could turn even confinement into propaganda. Their conflict was thus deeper than temperament. It was about narrative control. Each knew, in his own way, that St. Helena was being watched from afar. And it was. Newspapers, memoirs, private letters, political conversation across Europe, all contributed to the widening fascination with the exile. Some readers saw Napoleon as a tyrant receiving the logical end of his ambition. Others saw him as a giant diminished by vindictive governments afraid to confront his memory honestly. Still others held more mixed views, admiring his intellect while condemning the costs of his rule. What is striking is that few could simply ignore him. That was true in life, and it remained true in captivity. St. Helena did not end the Napoleonic presence in European consciousness, concentrated it. One subtle reason for this concentration was that distance simplified moral judgment without fully settling it. When Napoleon was emperor, he had to be evaluated through taxes, police measures, censorship, conscription, diplomacy, and the raw human cost of war. In exile, many of those practical dimensions faded from immediate view. What remained visible were broad symbolic contrasts. Greatness and smallness, action and confinement, ambition and fate, power and mortality. This made him easier to absorb into literature, political reflection, and private nostalgia. The closer he came to death, the more available he became as a figure onto whom different generations could project their own anxieties and hopes. Napoleon himself encouraged this process by the way he spoke about history. He liked to place events in long perspective. He described campaigns in terms not only of local necessity but of civilization, institutions, national character, and the relation between revolution and order. He could be deeply self-serving, but he was rarely trivial. That was part of his power. Even when justifying himself, he usually did so on a scale large enough to compel attention. He did not want posterity to remember him as merely successful. He wanted it to remember him as necessary. That desire for necessity shaped the way he cast the return from Elba. In the legend that gradually emerged, the escape became almost an act of historical inevitability, as though France had called him back because the restoration could not satisfy the conditions of the age. There is real insight in that version, though it omits much. Louis XVIII's regime did indeed struggle with legitimacy. The army did retain strong Napoleonic loyalties. The Allies were distracted. Napoleon did read the political temperature of France with extraordinary precision. Yet the move from Elba was also a profoundly contingent gamble. It succeeded because many things that might have failed instead aligned just enough. Napoleon's retrospective version softened that contingency. It made daring resemble destiny. This is one of the enduring strengths of Napoleonic memory. It can make as the years passed, the circle around Napoleon changed. Lost cases, whose early role in preserving conversations had been so important, was long gone. Others remained more steadily, including Bertrand and Montholin, along with household members whose loyalty was tested by monotony, conflict, and the ambiguous rewards of proximity to a fallen ruler. Their presence mattered not only for comfort but for witness. A man writing himself into posterity requires listeners, recorders, and custodians. Longwood was therefore still a court of a kind, though a court reduced to essentials: rank, loyalty, memory, and the daily management of decline. Decline itself did not arrive in a single sharp descent. There were fluctuations. Napoleon could still display intellectual energy, caustic humor, and moments of command presence. Visitors or observers sometimes remarked that even in physical reduction he retained something unmistakable, a density of personality difficult to diminish. Yet the general movement was downward. By 1820 and into 1821, his health had worsened sufficiently to raise more serious concern. The symptoms increasingly suggested a grave internal illness, though precise diagnosis remained uncertain to those around him. Later debates about stomach cancer, hereditary predisposition, medical treatment, and even poisoning would take on lives of their own. But for those present, the experience was simpler and more immediate. The emperor was fading. There is a quiet poignancy in how historical scale and physical fragility meet at such moments. Napoleon had once moved armies across continents. He had made kings and unmade them. He had dictated constitutions, codes, and campaigns. Now his world narrowed to the rhythms of a single house, a few rooms, a few attendants, letters, recollections, stomach pain, fatigue, and weather. Great power always ends this way in one sense. However large the public figure, the body eventually insists upon ordinary limits. But in Napoleon's case, the contrast was unusually severe, and therefore unusually memorable. As illness deepened, he returned more insistently to questions of family, inheritance, and remembrance. His son remained a distant and unrealized political hope, more symbol than practical continuity. His wife, Marie-Louise, had long ceased to be part of any plausible restoration of domestic or dynastic unity. The Bonaparte family itself had never been a simple structure of affection or reliability. Brothers, sisters, interests, ambitions, resentments, all the familiar complications of dynasty were present there too. Exile had not healed them. Yet family still mattered because it linked the private body to the public myth. Napoleon could not guarantee a political future for his line, but he could still imagine one. He also made arrangements for death. Wills, bequests, instructions, keepsakes, and symbolic gestures all began to matter more. Such acts are often read simply as practical necessity, but they also reveal how a person wants to be remembered. Napoleon's concerns were never purely private. Even in preparing for death, he was shaping a message. Who should receive what, how his son should be regarded, how his remains might someday be understood. These were not just sentimental details. They belonged to the larger management of legacy. At the same time, the outside political world continued to shift in ways that gave his memory fresh relevance. Restoration Europe was not at peace with itself in any final sense. Liberal discontent, national aspirations, constitutional struggles, and generational change all continued beneath the restored surface. In that setting, Napoleon's image remained available for reuse. To some, he represented military despotism. To others, he represented dynamism against stagnation. To still others, he represented what modernity looked like when embodied by a single overwhelming will. Saint Helena, intended as an ending, had become instead a chamber in which many future interpretations were already echoing. One of the more interesting reversals of these years is that Napoleon, who had so often been accused of overpowering institutions with personality, now depended upon institutions of memory to survive him. He needed texts, witnesses, readers, political climates receptive to his image, and later generations willing to imagine him not only as the cause of suffering but as the bearer of historical force. In this sense, exile democratized his legend. It carried him out of the battlefield and into the printed page, the salon, the memoir, the newspaper, the drawing room, the imagination of veterans, the ambitions of younger politicians, and eventually the rituals of public commemoration. By early 1821, his condition had deteriorated markedly. He spent longer periods indoors, often in bed or reclining, weakened and less able to sustain the old rhythm of discussion. Yet even then, recollection and significance did not vanish. Those around him remained acutely aware that they were present not merely at an illness, but at the ending of an era in personal form. This awareness inevitably shapes behavior. Conversations become weightier. Small remarks are remembered. Gestures acquire retrospective meaning. The dying person becomes at once fully human and almost immediately historical. Napoleon's religious feelings in his final illness have been described in varying ways, sometimes colored by later agendas. He had long inhabited a complex relation to religion, recognizing its political and social value while not fitting neatly into devout categories. In extremis, the forms of Catholic observance and identity did regain visible importance. Again, this should not be simplified. It would be too easy either to romanticize a full spiritual return or to dismiss such gestures as purely formal. What matters more is that death, like exile, drew him back into structures older than his own career. Ritual, mortality, confession, burial, remembrance. Even conquerors eventually re-enter these common human frames. He died on May 5, 1821 at Longwood. The weather on St. Helena that day has often been noted, as weather so often is when history senses symbolism nearby. But the more substantial point is this. The man whom Europe had once found too dangerous to leave near its shores was now a corpse on a remote Atlantic island. If one looked only at the practical outcome, it might have seemed that the Allied powers had succeeded completely. He had not escaped again. He had not returned. He had not overturned the settlement by force. The security problem had been solved. And yet the story did not stop there, because death altered the balance between body and legend one final time. A living Napoleon could still alarm governments. A dead Napoleon could begin to belong to memory more freely, and memory is often harder to police than a coastline. His burial on St. Helena, at the Valley of the Willows, was temporary in one sense and permanent in another. It marked the end of the man's physical movement, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in which France, Europe, and eventually the wider world would argue over what exactly had ended. For Bourbon France, his death removed a lingering threat but not the emotional problem of his memory. For Bonapartists, former soldiers, and many ordinary admirers, it transformed him further into a martyr of greatness constrained by hostile powers. For liberals and nationalists, he could be selectively admired or repurposed. For conservatives, he remained a warning about ambition released from lawful bounds. Few major figures have generated such varied and persistent afterlives, and St. Helena was central to that outcome. The island had reduced Napoleon's practical reach, but it had also purified the drama of his fall into something that could be retold endlessly. The British, too, found themselves in a complicated position. They had done what they thought necessary, and with strong reason. Elba had taught them that proximity was danger. Yet by guarding him to the end on a distant island, they also helped compose the image of the world conqueror feared so much that only the mid-Atlantic could contain him. Security had become inadvertent tribute. This is one of the most striking historical ironies in the entire story of the escape from Elba and its consequences. The more effectively Europe tried to prevent another return, the larger the previous return began to look. In France, that memory would continue to deepen over the following years. Veterans kept stories. Families kept relics. Political factions kept grievances and hopes. Writers kept shaping the image, but memory was not yet finished with the body itself. In the years after 1821, the question of Napoleon's remains, where they should rest, what France should do with them, and how the nation ought to remember him publicly, began to gather force in ways the restored order could not permanently avoid. Death on St. Helena had ended the man, but it had not settled the place he would occupy in French national imagination. In time, the issue of his return would arise again, not as emperor this time, but as remains, as symbol, and as a test of whether France still saw in him something larger than defeat. And that next return, quiet where the first had been electrifying, ceremonial where the first had been strategic, would carry its own powerful meaning as the years moved on and the memory of St. Helena traveled back across the sea toward Paris. And that next return, quiet where the first had been electrifying, would eventually bring Napoleon back to France in a form no army could stop and no coalition could contest. In 1840, nearly 2 decades after his death, the French government under King Louis-Philippe arranged for Napoleon's remains to be brought home from St. Helena. This was no longer the dangerous emperor returning with 1,000 men. It was something more controlled, more ceremonial, yet in its own way just as powerful. The retour de cendres, the return of the ashes, transformed Napoleon once again, not into a ruler, but into a national memory that could no longer be exiled. When his body arrived in Paris, the reception revealed something that had never truly disappeared. Crowds gathered. Veterans remembered. Citizens, many of whom had never lived under his rule, still felt drawn to the scale of his story. The state, which had once rejected him, now carefully embraced him, not as a political threat, but as a historical inheritance. He was laid to rest at Les Invalides, beneath the dome that would become one of the most recognizable sights in France. And here, in a way that no battlefield could achieve, Napoleon completed his final transformation. He was no longer the man of Elba, calculating a return. No longer the emperor at Waterloo, measuring time against collapsing opportunity. No longer the exile at St. Helena, shaping memory against confinement. He became something more enduring and more ambiguous. A symbol. For some, he remained the embodiment of ambition taken too far, a warning about power unchecked and war without limit. For others, he stood as the ultimate example of merit rising above birth, of energy overcoming stagnation, of a man who had reshaped Europe through sheer force of will. And for many, perhaps most, he became something quieter but more lasting. A figure who made history feel close, human, and almost within reach. That is why the escape from Elba still holds such fascination today. Because it was not just an escape. It was a moment when the past refused to stay buried. A moment when a defeated man walked back into power, not through overwhelming force, but through memory, hesitation, and the fragile structure of legitimacy. And in that sense, it tells us something that extends far beyond Napoleon himself. Power does not end cleanly. Reputation does not fade evenly. And history is rarely as settled as it appears. Sometimes it only waits. Before we close, I'd be genuinely interested to know, what part of Napoleon's story felt the most difficult to imagine living through? Was it the uncertainty of his return from Elba, the tension of Waterloo, or the isolation of St. Helena? And as always, feel free to share where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. If you've enjoyed this kind of calm, thoughtful deep dive into history, subscribing is a simple way to stay connected to future documentaries like this one. And if you found value in the story, a quiet like helps support the channel more than you might expect. Until next time, this is David Payton, and thank you for spending this time with me.